"He only hits me when he drinks," little girl whispered. The cashier walked off and never returned. Welcome back to our channel. Today we're sharing a powerful story that shows how one person's courage can change everything. This story deals with a sensitive topic but shows the incredible impact that happens when someone chooses to act instead of looking away. Before we begin, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support helps us share these important stories, and we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us which country you're watching from. Now, let's dive into this remarkable tale that took place in a small town in Colorado. Margaret, Maggie Thompson had worked at Patterson's Corner Grocery for 12 years, long enough to know every regular customer by name and to notice when something wasn't quite right. At 52 years old, she had raised 3 children of her own in the small town of Cedar Falls, Colorado, and possessed the kind of intuitive understanding that comes from years of watching over kids and recognizing the subtle signs that adults often missed. The grocery store sat at the intersection of Main Street and Elm Avenue, a modest establishment with creaky wooden floors and fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally, casting dancing shadows across the narrow aisles packed with everything from fresh produce to household necessities. Patterson's had been serving the community for over 40 years, and while it couldn't compete with the big chain stores 20 miles away in the city, it remained the heart of Cedar Falls, where neighbors gathered to catch up on local news and where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November when the familiar chime of the front door announced another customer. Maggie looked up from organizing the candy display behind the register, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, and saw them walking in together. 8-year-old Emma Walsh and her father, David Walsh. They had been coming to the store regularly for about 6 months, ever since David moved to Cedar Falls after his divorce, claiming he wanted a fresh start and a quieter life for himself and his daughter. David was a man in his early 30s with prematurely graying hair and the kind of nervous energy that made people uncomfortable without being able to pinpoint exactly why. He worked as a freelance web designer, which allowed him to work from home, but also meant he had very little interaction with other adults in the community. He was polite enough when he spoke to Maggie, always saying please and thank you, but there was something in his eyes that never quite met hers directly, something that reminded her of a cornered animal. Emma, on the other hand, was a beautiful child with long brown hair, usually pulled back in a ponytail, and bright blue eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond her 8 years. She was always well-dressed in clean clothes that fit properly, and she never asked for candy or toys like most children her age did when they accompanied their parents to the store. Instead, she would stand quietly beside her father, her small hands clasped in front of her, speaking only when spoken to, and always with a politeness that seemed almost rehearsed. Maggie had noticed things over the months, the way Emma flinched slightly when her father moved too quickly, how she never laughed or seemed genuinely happy despite her constant smile, and the careful way she chose her words as if she was afraid of saying something wrong. There were also the physical signs that Maggie's maternal instincts picked up on, the faint bruise on Emma's upper arm that she'd glimpsed when the child's sleeve rode up while reaching for something on a high shelf, the way she favored her left side when walking sometimes, and how she always wore long sleeves even on warm days. But most troubling of all was Emma's behavior around her father. The way she seemed to anticipate his moods, moving closer when he appeared calm and shrinking back when his voice carried even the slightest edge of irritation. The red flags had been accumulating in Maggie's mind like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, but today something felt different, more urgent, more dangerous than the subtle warnings she had been noticing over the past months. On this particular Tuesday, David Walsh appeared more agitated than usual, his movements sharp and impatient as he grabbed items from the shelves with unnecessary force. Maggie could smell the faint scent of alcohol on him even from several feet away, and she noticed how Emma stayed even closer to his side than normal, her small body tense with the kind of awareness that no child should have to develop. They moved through the store in silence, David filling a basket with basics, bread, milk, frozen dinners, and a bottle of whiskey that he placed on the counter with a defiant look that dared Maggie to comment. Emma stood perfectly still beside him, her eyes focused on a point somewhere near her feet, her usual forced smile notably absent from her face. As Maggie began scanning the items, her trained eye caught sight of something that made her heart skip a beat, a fresh bruise on Emma's wrist, visible just below the cuff of her pink sweater. It was finger-shaped and dark purple, the kind of mark that comes from being grabbed too tightly by an adult hand. The bruise was accompanied by what looked like rope burns around her small wrist, as if she had been tied up or restrained. Maggie's stomach lurched as she processed what she was seeing, her maternal instincts screaming that this child was in immediate and serious danger. "That'll be $37.50, Maggie said, her voice steady, despite the alarm bells ringing in her head. David fumbled for his wallet, his hands shaking slightly as he counted out crumpled bills, dropping a $5 bill that Emma quickly bent to retrieve for him. As the little girl leaned down, her sleeve rode up further, revealing more bruising that extended up her arm like a pattern of fingerprints. "Thank you, baby," David muttered, not meeting his daughter's eyes as she handed him the money. His voice carried a tone that was simultaneously affectionate and threatening, the kind of confusing mixed message that keeps victims off balance and unable to predict what might set off the next episode of violence. As David dealt with the payment, fumbling with his wallet and clearly impaired by whatever he had been drinking, Maggie found herself making eye contact with Emma for perhaps the first time since they'd been coming to the store. In that moment, something passed between them, a recognition, a desperate plea, a connection that transcended words. Emma glanced quickly at her father, who was focused on stuffing his change back into his wallet with the exaggerated care of someone trying to hide their intoxication, then looked back at Maggie with an expression that seemed to be weighing whether she could trust this kind-faced woman who had always smiled at her. The store was relatively quiet at this time of day, with only the hum of refrigeration units and the distant sound of a radio playing softly in the background. It was in this moment of relative privacy that Emma made a decision that would change everything. She leaned slightly toward Maggie, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, and said the words that would haunt Maggie for the rest of her life: "He only hits me when he drinks." The sentence was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone that children use when they've learned to normalize the abnormal, when they've been conditioned to believe that violence is simply a fact of life to be endured rather than escaped. Emma's eyes darted immediately back to her father, terror replacing the brief moment of courage that had allowed her to speak, and Maggie understood that this confession had taken every ounce of bravery the little girl possessed. The words hung in the air between them like a bomb that had just detonated silently, destroying any pretense that everything was normal in the Walsh household and confirming every terrible suspicion that Maggie had been harboring for months. Time seemed to slow down as Maggie processed what she had just heard, her mind racing through all the signs she had noticed and dismissed, all the moments when her instincts had told her something was wrong, but she had chosen to mind her own business like so many other adults who encountered Emma in their daily lives. David was still fumbling with his wallet, completely oblivious to the earth-shattering revelation that had just occurred 3 feet away from him. But Maggie could see Emma's growing panic as she realized what she had just confessed to a virtual stranger. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear, not just of her father discovering what she had said, but of the potential consequences that might follow if this secret was revealed to the wrong people or handled incorrectly. Maggie had worked with children long enough to understand that Emma's whispered confession wasn't just a cry for help, it was also a desperate attempt to reach out to someone who might understand, someone who might care enough to do something about her situation without making it worse. In that critical moment, with David's attention focused on his money and Emma's terrified eyes locked on hers, Maggie made a decision that would alter the trajectory of multiple lives. Without saying a word, without offering any explanation or excuse, she stepped back from the register, looked directly at Emma with an expression that communicated both understanding and determination, then turned around and walked away from her post. It wasn't a casual departure or a brief absence to grab something from the back room. It was a deliberate abandonment of her duties, a conscious choice to prioritize a child's safety over customer service protocols and job security. David looked up from his wallet, his alcohol-impaired brain taking several seconds to process the sudden absence of the cashier who had been ringing up his groceries just moments before. "Hey, where did she go?" he asked, his voice carrying the irritated tone of someone who believed the world should revolve around his convenience and had never learned to consider that other people might have priorities beyond serving his immediate needs. Emma said nothing, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the store could hear it, watching the space where Maggie had been standing and wondering if she had just made a terrible mistake that would somehow make her situation worse than it already was. Maggie walked quickly toward the back of the store, her hands shaking as she reached for the phone mounted on the wall next to the employee break room. She had never made a call like this before, had never been in a position where she had to decide whether to get involved in something that wasn't technically her business. But Emma's whispered words had shattered any illusion she might have had about staying neutral in the face of child abuse. The phone felt heavy in her trembling hands as she dialed 911, knowing that once she made this call, there would be no going back, no pretending she hadn't heard what she had heard or seen what she had seen. This wasn't about minding her own business anymore. This was about a child's life and safety, and that trumped every other consideration, including her own job security and the unspoken social contract that encouraged people to look the other way when confronted with uncomfortable truths about their neighbors and community members. 911, what's your emergency? Came the calm, professional voice on the other end of the line, trained to handle crisis situations with efficiency and compassion. I need to report suspected child abuse, Maggie said, her voice barely above a whisper as she glanced toward the front of the store where David was becoming increasingly agitated about her unexplained absence. There's a little girl here with her father, and she just told me that he hits her when he drinks. I can see fresh bruises on her wrists and arms, and I think she's in immediate danger. The operator immediately shifted into protocol mode, understanding that this wasn't a routine call, but a potential emergency involving a vulnerable child. Can you give me your location and stay on the line? The operator asked, simultaneously dispatching emergency responders while gathering additional information. Maggie provided the store's address and began answering the rapid-fire questions. Emma's name and approximate age, David's description and behavior, the specific nature of the injuries she had observed, and any other details that might help the responding officers assess the situation accurately. While Maggie was on the phone, David Walsh's irritation was escalating into something more dangerous and unpredictable. "Where the hell did that woman go?" he snapped, his voice loud enough to make Emma flinch visibly and draw the attention of other customers in the store. "This is ridiculous customer service. We don't have all day to stand around waiting for some incompetent cashier to do her damn job." His agitation was exacerbated by the alcohol in his system, which lowered his inhibitions and made it harder for him to control the anger that simmered constantly just below the surface of his carefully constructed public persona. Emma remained silent, but her body language spoke volumes. Shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make herself smaller and less visible, hands clenched at her sides until her knuckles turned white, eyes fixed on the floor in the practiced way she had learned to do when her father's mood was shifting toward violence. Other customers in the store began to notice the commotion, including Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who had taught elementary school for 30 years and possessed the same kind of protective instincts toward children that Maggie had developed through her own parenting experience. She moved closer, ostensibly to examine the magazine rack near the checkout counter, but actually to position herself where she could observe and potentially intervene if the situation escalated further. Meanwhile, Maggie was providing every detail she could remember to the 911 operator, who was simultaneously coordinating with local police, child protective services, and the district attorney's office to ensure that all appropriate agencies would be involved in Emma's case from the very beginning. "Officers are en route and should arrive within 3 to 5 minutes, the operator informed her. "A child protective services representative has also been contacted and is responding to your location. Can you remain on the line and continue to monitor the situation without putting yourself or the child in additional danger?" Maggie peered around the corner of the employee area and saw David's agitation continuing to build. His face flushed red with a combination of anger and alcohol, his voice becoming louder and more aggressive with each passing moment. Emma stood frozen beside him, and Maggie could see the fear radiating from the child's small frame like waves of heat rising from summer pavement. The little girl had learned to read her father's moods with the precision of a meteorologist tracking a dangerous storm, and she knew that his current behavior pattern typically preceded an explosive episode that would leave her nursing new injuries and making up new excuses to explain them to anyone who might notice. The sound of sirens in the distance was barely audible to most people in the store, but Maggie's trained ear caught it immediately, and she knew that within minutes, Emma's nightmare might finally begin to end. "I'm going back out there," Maggie told the operator. "I can't leave her alone with him when he's like this, and I want to make sure the officers can find them easily when they arrive." She hung up the phone and walked back toward the front of the store, her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to de-escalate the situation without making things worse for Emma or putting herself in danger. David's head snapped up when he saw her approaching, his eyes blazing with an anger that seemed completely disproportionate to the minor inconvenience of waiting a few extra minutes at a checkout counter. Finally, where the hell were you? Do you have any idea how unprofessional it is to just walk away from customers like that? I should report you to your manager and get you fired. Maggie forced herself to remain calm, drawing on years of experience dealing with difficult people and volatile situations. I apologize for the delay, sir. I had to handle an urgent situation, but I'm here now and I'll finish ringing up your items right away. As she moved behind the register, she caught Emma's eye and gave her the smallest possible nod, a gesture meant to communicate that help was coming and that she was not alone anymore. The little girl's eyes widened slightly, and Maggie saw a flicker of something that might have been hope cross her face before fear reasserted itself. The sirens were getting louder now, and David began to look around nervously, his alcohol-impaired brain slowly processing that emergency vehicles were approaching the area. 2 police cruisers pulled into the parking lot with their lights flashing, but sirens turned off, followed immediately by an unmarked sedan carrying Detective Sarah Martinez, who specialized in child abuse cases and had been specifically requested for this situation. The officers entered the store calmly, but purposefully, their trained eyes immediately identifying David and Emma based on the descriptions provided by the 911 operator. Mr. Walsh, Detective Martinez approached with her badge visible, but her demeanor non-threatening. I'm Detective Martinez with the Cedar Falls Police Department. We've received some concerns about your daughter's welfare, and we'd like to speak with both of you. David's face went pale as the reality of the situation began to sink in, his eyes darting between the detective, the other officers, and Emma, who was standing very still, but watching everything with the intensity of someone whose entire future was being decided in that moment. I don't know what you're talking about, David stammered, his voice lacking conviction. There must be some mistake. Emma, tell them everything's fine. But Emma, for the first time in months, didn't automatically obey her father's command. Instead, she looked at Detective Martinez and said in a clear, steady voice, "He hits me when he drinks, and he drinks every day." The truth, once spoken aloud in front of witnesses who had the power to act on it, seemed to give Emma strength she didn't know she possessed. The subsequent investigation revealed a pattern of abuse that had been escalating over months, hidden behind David's carefully constructed facade of respectability and Emma's trained silence. David was arrested that day and eventually sentenced to prison, while Emma was placed in the loving care of her maternal grandparents who had been fighting for custody since the divorce, but had been blocked by David's manipulation of the legal system. Maggie never returned to her cashier position that day, but not because she was fired. She was offered a job with the county's Child Protective Services Department, where her natural ability to recognize signs of abuse and her willingness to act on behalf of vulnerable children made her an invaluable advocate for dozens of families. Emma grew up in a safe, loving environment and eventually became a social worker herself, dedicating her life to helping other children find their voices and escape dangerous situations. The ripple effect of Maggie's decision to walk away from that register continued for years, inspiring other community members to speak up when they suspected abuse and creating a network of protection around the children of Cedar Falls that hadn't existed before. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to pretend that everything is normal when you know it isn't. And sometimes walking away from what's expected of you is the first step toward doing what's right.